Welcome to Dear Diaspora, a podcast celebrating the African diaspora and the changemakers, innovators, and entrepreneurs working to make our world a better one to live in. I'm your host, Ndulwa Kowa. Let's get started. Welcome to season 3 of the show. I am so excited to be back with brand new episodes of Dear Diaspora. If you're a new listener, thank you for tuning in. Be sure to follow the podcast on social media at Dear Diaspora for updates, special announcements, interesting content from across the African diaspora, and much more. All right, so before we get into the episode, I am so excited to share that there's now a way you can officially support the show. Dear Diaspora is now on Patreon. Patreon allows you to support your favorite content creators, and in exchange, you get exclusive content only available to you via the Patreon platform. I'll be putting out bonus episodes and video interviews on there, and you also get access to podcast merch and opportunities to become a part of the show by either becoming a guest contributor or a guest collaborator. I would love your support as I continue to grow the show, so please visit patreon.com/Dear Diaspora. That's patreon.com/Dear Diaspora, or check out the link in the show notes to learn more and become a patron today. Happy new month, Diaspora fam, and thank you so much for tuning in to episode 52 of the show. Time is really just flying by. I can't believe Thanksgiving is already over and it's December and we're getting ready for, end of year things and planning for 2021. This has certainly been an interesting year, and I just calculated that I've been working remotely fully since March. So it's been 9 months, and that's just wild to think about. Wherever you're listening from, I hope that you are continuing to do all that you can to stay safe and social distance and keep your loved ones safe. For today's episode, I had the pleasure of having a conversation with Akinyade, Adelere, and Oyin Aderele, the hosts of the Pod Save Africa podcast. Pod Save Africa is a community platform sharing African perspectives on African narratives. The podcast explores the interesting details of our history, our present, and our hopes for the future through weekly podcast episodes, and I highly recommend that you check it out. During our conversation, Akinyade and Oyin share what exactly inspired them to even launch the Pod Save Africa podcast, their initial reactions to this most recent wave of NSARS protests, what, if anything, the NSARS protests learned from the Black Lives Matter movement, what role the diaspora and celebrities across the diaspora play during times like these, and how they stay hopeful and encouraged while covering heavy topics. Without further ado, here's our conversation. Akinyade and Oyin, welcome to Dear Diaspora. I'm so excited to have you.
Excited to be here.
For having us.
Absolutely. Super excited to have you both. I'm a fan of your podcast, and it was, one of the first that I came across when I was looking for Africa-focused podcast content. So super excited to just get to know you both a bit more. Let's start by getting to just know a bit more about your backgrounds. Where are you both from, and where did you grow up?
I'll let my sister kick us off.
I was going to let you kick us off, but we are both from Lagos, Nigeria. That's where we spent most of our formative years. But we also went to boarding school in Osho, Nigeria. And so spending formative years means really just going back on vacation to Lagos. And once we were done with our secondary school education, which is high school, we came to the US for college. Akinyade is a year older than me, so he came a year before I did. And we've been in the US since then. So between the both of us, I think we've been in the US for about 9 years. A little more for my brother than me. Yes, and I'm not sure what else to add. I get it.
Sure. So I guess I was expecting you to introduce yourself a little more, but I'll take the reins and do the honors. My wonderful sister here works for one of the largest engineering manufacturers in the world, helping them make money basically. I, on the other hand, I'm a little more boring. I quit my job a few months ago to work in to go back to school. I'm pursuing my MBA at the University of Chicago. I'm trying to understand finance and things of that nature. I started Port of Africa 4 years ago now in my tiny little apartment on the south side of Chicago, both as a way for me to reconnect with the continent, but two, because much like Ndogo was saying, you hop on the podcasting kind of platforms and you start to look for Africa-focused podcasts. And back then, there was nothing. It was like 2 podcasts, a BBC Africa podcast and one on, I think, China and Africa.
Yeah.
I think so. It wasn't particularly reflective of what Africans themselves actually thought about Africa. So we founded the podcast to effectively tell those stories and capture what Africa looks like from the African perspective. So yeah, that's both of us.
Wow. Awesome. You both are like the first brother-sister duo I've ever interviewed. So this is super cool. Before we get more into the pod, I'd love to hear about just your experience. You said you've been in the US for like 9 years roughly. What was it like when you first arrived in the United States? And just, I'd love to just hear more about that.
Sure, I could go first. So coming to the US was the first time I really recognized that I was African. I wouldn't say that I knew that before. Of course, I'm Nigerian, so I'm African, but it's the first time I really had that title plastered across my face, because everyone you meet, oh, you're from Nigeria, oh, you were African, So I think it's one of it spurred the interest in Africa, because I was forced to identify as African so boldly. And so coming to the US, thankfully the school that I went to had a lot of, well, not a lot, but it had a bit of African presence. I had friends from Zimbabwe, from South Africa, Ethiopia, Rwanda. And so getting to meet other people from the continent that we were all kind of grouped together, forcefully or not, it really made me have an interest in learning more. And while I was in college, I got engaged with the ASA, the African Students Association, right from my sophomore year, and continued to be engaged either as the public relations officer to secretary to vice president. So I was really involved in that organization and learning more. Within my college experience also, I also got the opportunity to visit and live in 2 other African countries, Ethiopia and Zambia, as I was telling you. And that really, for me, that experience taught me that we're so different from each other, and learning those differences and learning how those differences can work together has been my thought process since then. So with the podcast and just general reflection in life.
And what would you say some of those major differences are, like from your time spent in Zambia and Ethiopia, you said?
Yes. So this is a small thing, but it was major in my eyes, just the inflection. So if you want to announce surprise, the way to sound in a Nigerian environment is very different from the way to sound in a Southern African country like Zambia. Is very different from the way it was sound in Ethiopia. And I like that we all had our inflections, but the differences were also interesting. But also everything, really, the food is different across these 3 different countries. The culture too is slightly different, even though there are some similarities.
Thanks for expanding on that a little bit. And Akinyade?
Sure. So I was the first of my family to come here study in the United States. My parents were kind enough to send me from 90-degree Lagos straight to 30-degree Chicago for my first degree here. So a little bit of a weather transition there. I remember on a particular day thinking, like, why would human beings like live in this type of place that's so cold? That being said, I'm back again, so I'm clearly a glutton for punishment. But coming here the first time, I think I I think I was largely in awe of how people could build such a robust, what felt like a robust society at the time. Just feeling like efficiency. You go to the DMV and you need your license and you get it in one day. Like certain things were so outrageous to me, and I expected a high level of difficulty with everything. For me, that meant that I was a lot more cautious with my information. I didn't ask as many questions, and that affected me personally, academically, and on a few other fronts. So I had to wean myself out of that kind of like overly cautiousness that's growing up in Nigeria, growing up, I would imagine, in many other African countries teaches you. In addition to that, even my sense of Africanness, much like Oyin, has changed because we had a decently sized African community at the university I went to. It suddenly meant that, two of my best friends were Kenyan and Liberian, right? Two opposite sides of the continent. And it changed the way I started to think about, one, the ways we're extremely similar, the united destiny that each of our countries have had, some of it forced on us by colonialism and many things like that, but also, just by the ways we're similar. If you look deeply into African history, many of our countries are formed from the same original migratory groups from Central Africa. So like we even biologically are mostly somewhat, related and associated with each other. It's why many of our languages sound the same and things like that. So I just kind of became a nerd for that stuff, helped found the African Student Organization on our campus. And I've cared deeply about the continent ever since. And in my apartment, in my senior year, we used to have these like Wednesday night arguments, or we'll invite a bunch of Africans from different countries and we'll just like go crazy, argue, bicker about some topic or another. And it really just, I think that ended up being the precursor to this podcast, because I just thought to myself, wouldn't it be wonderful for people to hear these conversations? America has certainly been an interesting journey so far. I've liked it enough for me to have stayed for so long. And I also met the love of my life here. So my wife, I met here, and it's certainly been a remarkably rewarding experience so far for me.
Wow. Well, thank you both for sharing a bit more about your journeys and what it was like, adjusting to living in the United States. I definitely could relate to a lot of what you mentioned, especially Akinyade. You mentioned just being more cautious and having to kind of like unlearn that, like in different contexts like that. I definitely can relate to. I remember like being in school and like even the concept of like talking back to a teacher, I didn't even know that was a thing. Like I was so shocked whenever people would just be acting up in class, because back home that meant you're gonna get punished, or so getting used to that, I can definitely relate to. So let's move on. So you started having these conversations and, debates about different Africa-focused topics. Like, how did your sister get involved? Like, how did you guys decide to say, like, okay, this is something we can both do together?
Well, I got involved as a critic. I'll be honest. So I'm passionate about anything my family is involved in. So I would always listen, and then I would go, I'm like, okay, maybe you should do this. Maybe you should record like this. Maybe you should do this instead. And one day he was like, so why don't you get involved if you're going to talk so much about it? And I was like, you know what? Why not? But I got involved willing to be on the back end. So I'm an introvert, so I prefer things that don't put me on the spotlight. So I wanted to be involved with the information digging and communications and things like that, which I still am for the most degree. But getting involved, I always say that he kind of conned me into it, because once I was involved, then he was like, okay, maybe you should co-host with me one day. And I was like, sure. And then he was, sometimes it's, maybe you should host your own episodes. And I'm like, but that's really it. And it's been an upwards trajectory since then, in terms of learning and in terms of journey and in terms of personal growth. So I am lucky that I decided to criticize him so much. That's how I got involved.
Wow. And I just love how again, like I mentioned earlier, you're both like super passionate just about the continent. Like, what's it like working as siblings? Because I know my brother and I, we'd be butting heads all the time.
I think that there are lots of massive, wonderful benefits to it. One, just access. Like, she's my sister. I'm talking to her all the time, anyways. And my sister and I have a very close relationship in the first place, so that helps. That we're just in constant. I'm not like hitting her up because for the first time every month, like, hey, let's record now. So it's a very easy dynamic in that sense. I think you learn. We both learned is that we both learn to like interact on a, how do I put this, a slightly professional level. When with regards to the podcast, like with what we have meetings with agendas, like boom, boom, boom. Here's what we have to go through. Here are objectives. Here's the tools we're going to use to achieve them. Here's the timelines. Here are the deadlines, etc., etc. So we take ourselves very seriously, and make sure that if we need help, we're asking each other for support. It's helped the relationship to be effective. I remember fairly early on in the podcast, just probably a couple of months after you joined, one of the conversations we're having was about like breaking up the season into smaller pieces. When I started the podcast, I was like, an episode a week for life. Like you go get these episodes every week. I was like, Megan came to me and said, okay, we need to let these episodes breathe. Let's break this into smaller seasons. And for me, it was like here and there, like, you might as well just cut off my arm. I was like, no, the episode, please. Come on. And just learning to like, at the time, I just kind of bit the bullet as per. So, okay, well, I'll get some rest out of this. But at the time, just learning to trust the people you work with. And that bore fruit of like more people listen to our episodes. We had more time to market episodes we'd already put out and things like that. So just having the opportunity to sit, to like listen, to work with somebody I can trust and knows means the best for me, regardless, is wonderful. And ideally, quite honestly, I take kind of our relationship and our dynamic and hope to implement that on dynamics I have in the professional world. Like I try to instill that trust, like we both mean the best for each other. Let's work like that's the case.
It taught me really how to offer constructive criticism, not just starting from the podcast level, but even in our personal relationship, because we were able to kind of butt heads in that manner and offer constructive criticism to each other. We're able to kind of offer the same type of constructive criticism in our personal lives too, and not be as emotional about it as we would have before if we probably had never worked on the podcast and things like that. So it's been a win-win situation so far.
Love it. I bet you guys are like every parent's dream. Like both doing productive things in grad school, getting along. That is amazing to see. And so I'd love to kind of switch gears a little bit. So I know in one of your most recent episodes, you covered some of like the movements that are happening across the continent, and the issues that people are, highlighting and just bringing light to. I'd love to get your thoughts on the End SARS movement, especially with you guys both being from Nigeria. I'd love to just hear your thoughts on just everything happening right now.
Okay, I'll start this one. You gave me that smile. So I think that there are two ways to look at this. Well, there are two important things to think about. The first is kind of the overall context in which End SARS and many other movements across the continent are happening, and then what's happening kind of internally in each of those countries and how those movements are doing. Looking kind of broadly, we have a continent that has more young people as a percentage of its population than any in the world. Unfortunately, those young people are met, and summarizing everything about many of the contexts on the continents, a lot of those young people are met with leadership that has set up a situation where those young people don't feel like there's a particularly hopeful future. And that really is the worst case scenario you can have for the young people. In fact, the most successful of countries, the thing they do best is just convince young people that the future is bright, the future is hopeful. And we've gone from an age where, for example, Nigerian kids are being promised, you're the future of this nation, to like, we ain't got nothing for you. Like, it is what it is. It sucks. Too bad. And I must caveat all this by saying I fundamentally believe the future is hopeful of not just Nigeria, but every African country, because I think everything that is necessary for success is already there, right? It's just mixing the potion together. And these kids and I say kids, I'm a kid, but these folks, these young people are starting that pot. They're starting to stir that pot. They're asking for accountability. And all of the protests across the country, one common theme is we're asking for accountability from our leaders and from our governments. We're saying, hey, this is what we expect from you. You are here to serve us. Do better. NSARS in Nigeria is the police shouldn't pull you over at risk of life just because you have a laptop. You shouldn't be arrested or thrown in jail for months on end without reason or without trial. I shouldn't have to have money to be safe from the police in my country. Why? Because very few people have the amount of money required to be safe from police in Nigeria. I shouldn't be extorted by the people meant to protect and serve me. And those are the fundamental demands of folks against the NSARS. However, what that notches on is accountability. That we need our governments to be more accountable. And it's this is what we need to be asking, and we're asking for it. However, as you saw on October 20th, yesterday was a 1-month anniversary of that horrible, horrible day. The Nigerian government chose to, through its whims, through whoever ordered the shooting, because now they want to make it seem like, oh, we don't know who did it. Somebody was just shooting at somebody, or in fact, there was no shooting. It's important that we do not let that narrative be passed. I think CNN has done a good job in picking up the stories. And I'm hoping they do so for stories across the continent. So at least our internal media gets platforms so that they can tell our stories more accurately. But fundamentally, what you're seeing is the government's overarching reaction to that. And my recommendation is that in whatever way we can't afford to let up. We can't afford for the government to think that just a little bit, any violence is the answer to squashing it. Because what that means is that, and in any case moving forward, violence is always going to be their go-to. We have to figure out a way to nullify that. I don't have the answers, but I know that this is a critical time, and if we can't save our countries now, we won't have many chances to do it ahead of our children being born.
Yeah, just to add on, none of the movements that have occurred these past few months are new. So even NSARS, this is not the first time that it's come up, but it's on a larger scale. And for me, that's exciting because it means the next time people decide to gather like this, it will even be bigger and even be better and even be more organized and even be more effective. And that for me is exciting. I'm even just thinking of the number of conversations that it's spurred since then, the number of conversations that I've gotten engaged with like-minded individuals trying to butt heads and think about actionable steps that can be taken and how to avoid mistakes that were made during the movement. Not that the movement was a mistake, but how to avoid probably less bloodshed, less incidents like the Lekki massacre. But it's not new, and the thing about African governments is that their tactics largely remain the same. Whereas we are a group of people, young people, where we are always evolving. Nothing is really ever the same between this month and 2 months ago. And because of that, we have an advantage, and eventually change will come.
Wow. Thank you both, Akinyade, for providing that context and kind of sharing why, like now in particular, is the time that, young people in Nigeria have really started to demand more accountability from the Nigerian government. And thank you, Oyin, for expanding on that and sharing more about just how creative and innovative young people are. And that's definitely something that's exciting. Being from Nigeria, what were, like, I guess when the protests first started, like, how did you guys react to them? Because I'm not from Nigeria, but even I was, getting quite overwhelmed just by everything I was seeing. It was super emotional. how are you both reacting to that, like super early on?
Just to perhaps start with sharing a story. I remember when we were super young, we were probably about 11 or 12. I don't know if my sister remembers this, but we were going to a friend's house. My dad and my mom were driving us to a friend's house, fairly close to us, probably 2-3 miles away. And the rapid anti-robbery squad, the very early version of what is now SARS, pulled us over in the car. And I remember them attempting to pull my dad physically out of the car, and the guy the other police running to the other side, hustling with the door on my mother's side. My dad gets angry. Fortunately enough, we've had family that's involved with the judicial system, so we were able to call them up, and that kind of was what kind of calmed down the situation. But having seen multiple permutations of that, permutations where they shoot somebody just immediately and that person's dead and gone. There are many permutations where that could have gone very bad. It doesn't matter who you know in the moment, right? And understanding through friends who live in Nigeria currently, we have an uncle who stays with us who's been pulled over by police or harassed multiple times and extorted, just because he's a young person driving a car, a young man driving a car. It's like, on top of the vast majority of injustices in our society, I also can't just go about doing my bit. I can't even mind my business in peace, right? And that's really the lesson it tells us about incompetence, right? That eventually gets to us all. Like, no matter how rich, how poor, whatever you think you are that insulates you from it, eventually it gets to you. And from the jump, from the very, very early NSAS movement, from all the way to the previous government, I don't know if one can remembers, but I think the first ones were in like maybe 2011, 2012. Like, this is not the first iteration of this. We've always supported and believed that this was a righteous action. Now, of course, protest and format is also important. This was the first time I was like, oh, okay, we've been strategic. Now the people are protesting in front of a place that is not, peacefully in front of a place where, of course, the toll gate is a big revenue generator for the government, and people are just avoiding because they support the protesters. The government's not generating revenue, so they're going to, there's pressure on their necks. And of course, we've all seen how the government reacted to that. So now I think we're now in the phase, like Oyin said, we're iterating. What does version 12 of this look like now? How can we be just as effective in putting pressure on them, whereas de-risking people's lives? Because there's nothing that's worth somebody being hit by a bullet from a soldier. There's no amount of lives that equates that we can put a price on. So it's important that we optimize for that de-risking. And I think that's how we move forward. But once again, I say I don't have the answers. Lots of fantastic people, Feminist Co in Nigeria, did a remarkable job organizing and supporting the protesters. I've generally just found that across the entire continent, women are leading these protests. The women are organizing these protests and are doing a fantastic job doing so. As far as I'm concerned, we need to make women our presidents as quickly as possible. The most qualified women, of course, because they are evidently doing a much better job than a lot of the men we see currently in power.
Wow, thank you so much for that, Akinyade. And so I've heard a number of just opinions and perspectives about NSARS, and I would love to hear just what you think is a potential solution moving forward. Like, I've heard some people say, the SARS officers maybe should be paid more so they don't feel that they need to like extort people and threaten people to, get, additional, money in their pockets. I've heard that as a solution. And then some obviously have said that doesn't really address the issue. I would love to just hear what you think practical solutions could be to addressing some of these injustices that are committed by SARS.
Monica, do you want to take the reins?
Sure. I'll have to agree. I don't think that paying the police more is an effective solution, at least not a long-term solution. That's like trying to put a plaster over a hole in the ground. Almost, it doesn't really solve anything, because the truth of the matter is a lot of people, a lot of professions in Nigeria are not earning much at all. There's just a general level of poverty in the nation, and you pay them more and they're okay with it for some time, and then they get greedy again. The fact is, corruption is so pervasive in our society that it would just it would just sit back out. It would just become more. They just start to become more. I think one effective solution is really to take away their guns. I don't know why a policeman that is working on the road has a gun on him. And even in societies that we live in the US and the UK, you generally don't, well, at least not an AK-47. Like that's a fighting gun. That's like I'm going to war. And these are the guns that the policemen have working on the streets. I think take away their guns, give them batons, give them touchlights, give them some other form of um, guard that they don't have to use guns for. I also think that there is no level of transparency in most organizations in Nigeria, most government organizations. And I think that improving the transparency of things, whereas people are not able to commit hideous crimes under the guise of policing and get away with it, is another effective measure. Other than that, I think the 5 for 5 was pretty detailed, but that was the only piece of it that I did not agree with, the paying them more, because it doesn't solve much in the long term.
I think everything Oyin said spot on. The problem, like she mentioned, is systematic. There's no position in public service of any sort in Nigeria that you don't find these issues with corruption, right? The person who has power is always trying to take advantage of the people who don't, right? The policemen in that case are using their power of, honestly, military grade weapons to intimidate people. Teachers, especially male lecturers, using their power of authority over your grade to cajole students for all types of things: money, food, sex. As we saw through some revelations that last year that verified what we've known for decades. You see through, public officials of any sort to go try and get your driver's license in Nigeria and see how much money you have to pay to get around this, that, and the next, just to see your thing in the time that they tell you should be getting it in anyways. And that's systematic issues. And I fundamentally don't think that any significant change can happen in Nigeria without a systematic approach, right? And then to build good systems, you also have to have a government or an administration with a moral standing to do so. The Buhari administration had a good chance. They came in, this guy was supposed to be this upright, upstanding guy that, is never corrupt, but I was going to root it out of the system. A person who comes in with that impression has the opportunity to say, okay, I need systems that do boom, 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 this, and that, and next. I need to make sure that there's accountability in our police force all the way through the government. That was his opportunity. He failed. He's failing. He will likely continue to fail. That's just the honest truth. And what we have, the denigration of the system, is a result of not only somebody failing to do things better, but even failing to do things as well as worse as they were done before. Right. And figuring out a way out requires, in my opinion, two things. I think African people, and this is consistent across just about every African country, are under leveraged relative to their governments. And we need to figure out how to switch that leverage back. In the worst cases of scenario, it leads to civil war. People just pick up and say, oh, you guys aren't going to take care of us. You're going to attack us with bullets. You're not the only one who can find guns. We'll figure it out and we'll see how it goes. That's what's happened in many Middle Eastern countries over the past couple of decades. The other opportunity there, however, is through the power of leveraged votes over time. It's slower for sure. I think it's a more successful route. It's why things like NSAS encourage me, because amongst all of the kind of protesting and standing, there was a lot of people talking about, hey, how do we get out the votes for the next election? How do we make sure that, that the politician who brings a bag of rice or brings a couple thousand naira and throws it around doesn't get to influence the election, because we remember what happened today. Those are the important conversations I see happening. And I'm truly, truly just hoping those can be leveraged in the right direction for good.
I think also with the NSARS movements, one thing that stood out to me is that it promoted a lot of education, just even about basic things like what is your basic right as a Nigerian citizen. And for me, that was important because I was learning. Everyone seemed to be learning and picking up things, and because they were learning, they were more engaged. They are more engaged. People are still doing things today, and I think that that's one pathway forward, is really just education, and not education between smaller circles, but between the larger population as well. I think I agree with Akinyade that I think it has to start from the lower level. It has to slowly build up, because war isn't good for anyone. Having those civil uprisings like Akedi has described, the amount of bloodshed is unimaginable, and nothing should come to that. But I think if it's a slow build up, start from the local communities, let them know this is what you have your rights to, and let them exercise those, and tell them how they can exercise those rights, and then slowly start to build up. You'll see that things slowly change. It might be slow, but it might also be quickly, because now we have technology and all of these things that quicken the rate of things than prior before. So that, I think that's probably a good direction to move towards.
Absolutely. It was definitely, or it's been really great to just see different people speak out about it, and really educate folks. And I think, or I would say it's also very inspiring for other countries who are facing similar issues, even if they haven't had, a movement as big as this most recent, like NSARS one. I think it's shown people like their power, young people especially, just how powerful they are. So obviously the loss and, just the brutality that's happened during this period is unfortunate. But I'm hopeful that, outside of this, or just moving forward, it'll serve as just a moment that really inspired young people across the continent. And so I've heard people say things like, I think there's an article that I read that was like, oh, building off the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, this End SARS movement, happened. I guess some folks are saying that this was inspired by, the massive movements that happened in the States, like this past summer. Do you guys see like a connection at all, or do you think that's a little bit of a reach?
I think it's a reach. Just based off the fact that there have been previous momentum in this airspace before, and based off the fact that protests have slowly become a thing within our nation, Nigeria. There's been and I don't remember the name exactly. There was a march for women's rights, the Market March, I think that's what it was called, a couple of years ago. And there've been others that have they've raised awareness. They've given people opportunities to exercise their rights. They've shown them how to exercise rights. And protests have been happening in our nation like that. I think the only connection I see is that, similar to the Black Lives movements and the NSAS, it was just at a point where people had time to pay attention. There's not much else going on in a pandemic. And also, like, it's almost like everyone was pushed against the wall with the Black Lives Matter movement and with the NSARS. I think it's a bit of a reach to say that the Black Lives Matter movement made people that kind of promoted the NSARS movement. But Akinade, what are your thoughts?
So I have a slightly different opinion there. I think one, I agree with Oyin. Like Nigeria has a long history of people standing up. They have our women's rights. They have like it's almost part and parcel of Nigerian history, right? People standing up for themselves against the government in different ways. However, I don't think it would be wrong to say this has been one of the most effective ones in human history, in Nigerian history. In terms of just the scale, the literally started a national conversation, which almost never happens. And that's down to two things. One, the fact that so many people were involved, but two, the way in which it was managed, both like, publicity, things like that, money, funding, and honestly, many of the models for structuring and supporting and funding the protests, there's no other there's no, the precursor to that is the Black Lives Matter. We have to keep it at 100%. A lot of the structures or systems for maintaining it definitely came from my impression from the Black Lives Matter movement, at least softly, right? We were seeing these things, we were getting ideas. It might not have been a direct, hey, okay, they're doing this, let's run over and do this. But at some point you watched, people getting food at Black Lives Matter movements. You watch people fundraising through GoFundMe. You watch people doing Bitcoin donations as opposed to money, cash transfer donations. And those things stuck in the many organizers' heads. And of course, I can't speak for them. But I would be remiss to say that, a lot of the organizers I've seen being vocal in both the Black Lives Matter movements, shortly after also now organizing the helping to organize and support the protesters at the Lekki toll gate. It will be difficult for me to say that those things, that there isn't some influence and association. I think that it's helped culture a message in terms of Nigerians are protesting police brutality. Prior to this, it was like NSARS, right? It was like, okay, NSARS, this group, this one segment of people sucks. And SARS is a very specific to Nigeria thing. Whereas when you tie that with this idea of police brutality, that's much more easy to identify with because of the Black Lives Matter movements and the activities in the United States. So I think those things are inextricably tied. In fact, if I keep it a buck with you, and go all the way back to like 1960s, when did the civil rights movement happen in the United States? In the 60s. When did most African countries see independence? In the 60s. Like our history has always been inextricably tied, influencing each other one way versus the other. I think it's just the same case here.
Absolutely. Thank you both for sharing your perspectives on that. A lot of people were, really calling out the silence, or bringing attention to the silence of some, let's say, African Americans or Black Americans who typically would be vocal about Black Lives Matter, but then they may not necessarily have said anything about, the NSARS movement. Do you think that in moments like that, people have like a duty to bring attention to similar movements that are happening globally, or do you care more that Africans are the ones that are aware and spreading the word or getting the word out about these movements?
I'll be honest, I didn't really know how to feel about that. Whether good or I really didn't know really how to feel about that. I understood why people were asking for people with bigger platforms who have spoken about similar issues to raise awareness, because awareness is important and helps to bring a lot of things to this light. And understandably, the awareness has led to organizations like CNN doing the research and digging and doing forensic analysis, whereas we will not have been able to do it within our nations ourselves. But at the same time, it's like these people, when they started out their platforms to be singers, to be musicians, that was not their mission. It's not their responsibility in a sense. And for me, it's kind of idolizing them to the point that you expect them to be part of their responsibility too. So I have mixed feelings about it. One thing that I kind of agreed with was with Nigerian American people who are very boldly and very proudly Nigerian, who that's part of their shtick, that's part of their image, that's part of what they sell. And it's very obviously part of what they sell. I'm I always believe that if you're going to stand by a point, you should represent all sides of that coin. If you're going to stand by a point, so that's where I did agree that if this is part of their shtick, if you're going to represent this side of it, represent this side too, because both of them exist, right? But if that wasn't really their thing, then I didn't really understand the pull for other people. Yes, it's very important that they do that. The awareness they're bringing is amazing. It's large scale. You can't imagine the number of people that saw Beyonce's post, for instance. But the clamoring at Beyonce to speak up, I didn't. Or canceling, or canceling her, attempted to cancel her and things like that. I didn't quite understand. So I don't know that I've really expressed an opinion here. I think I had mixed feelings about the entire thing.
It's certainly, I truly wish I could say that there was a moral, hey, this is what the right thing to do. In our hearts, we feel like the right thing to do is any injustice issue anywhere, speak out against it. And one of the fundamental things we need to understand is that if I see a celebrity of some sort hasn't spoken out against Myanmar, hasn't spoken out against a bunch of different atrocities happening across the world, they're on brand. They're not, like, maybe for their brand, maybe for their money, maybe it's affecting their back some way. They've just decided that, I don't get enough value from this to do this. And I'm a little bit of I'm an optimist generally, but on some things I think humans are largely self-serving in one way or another. So even without the people with personal risk, even when they put out support, I'm always careful to take support on Twitter as an endorsement. Or I say, we'll give you money. It might just be, all right, let's stop bothering me. Here's your tweets. #NSRS, cool, leave me alone. As opposed to actual support. The primary reason I think we were pushing for a lot of celebrities and lots of people with platforms to admonish this situation was because we wanted two things to happen. One, we wanted to do a shame campaign against the Nigerian government. So, like, shame on you for killing your people. Shame on you for this horrible, horrible things you've done. I wanted as many eyes on it as possible. Now that of course comes with some risk, right? So, like, okay, you want it to be shame on the Nigerian government, not shame on Nigeria as a whole, and then make the people suffer more in their image just because the government is doing a terrible job. And the second part of it, I think the more perhaps effective part of it, is that we wanted to limit the ability to access the world outside of Nigeria, right? A lot of our politicians live life lavishly simply because the world is their oyster. They can steal as much money as they can from Nigeria and then go live life lavishly elsewhere. It's the same in many African countries. The plan was, or the most effective utilization of that shame campaign is that other countries say, oh, okay, we're banning visas from all the high-level government officials from Nigeria. That country that you're killing people in should stay there. Like that's where you have to stay there. That's where you have to stay now. And for better or for worse, I don't know if that has ever been effective in the past, but for better or for worse, people effectively steal in the issues that they've had. Our president, Buhari, travels for medical treatment like every couple of months, right? Mans must be going through it with this COVID thing right now, but like his life is benefited by the fact that he's the head of state and he has access to other countries. Maybe if we reduce that access and put the squeeze on these people, maybe then that they do things better. I don't know if that's an effective route, but it's something. And I think that can be achieved whether or not Beyonce tweets NSAS. I just, like, what's the actual goal? Like, Beyonce tweeting NSAS is like, all right, cool. Like, she's famous, she has a platform. She uses African imagery very frequently, so it feels like a betrayal, and I get that. But what's the goal at the end of the day, right? Do we just care about Beyonce tweeting a thing, or do we care about what the effect is on Nigeria and its people?
Right. And I think just to add on to that point, I prefer if people, when they do share the information, that they share correct information. I prefer if they share correct information than if they don't share information at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one thing I noticed, that people were so quick to jump to sharing the information that they may not have been 100% sharing the right information. And that's even worse. Like if bad information goes out, that's worse than if, no information goes out at all. So all in all, that's where I stand. I didn't really understand the clamor. I understood the importance of it, but didn't understand the push down on it. I think people were upset that Beyonce's stylist, someone in her team effectively said that, oh, we work in silence, we don't have to post about everything.
Yeah, she just kept
Oh,
quiet.
wow.
Which I agree, she probably should have just kept quiet. But other than
She's
that.
moving in silence like lasagna. It's like, come on.
Wow. Yeah, thank you both. I definitely I see, both sides. Like in the case of Beyonce, because she's over the last couple of years, she's kind of positioned herself as this pro-Black, pro-Africa, and incorporating that into her work and just things that she does. So I think her being silent does look bad, because it just doesn't align with just a lot of the projects and stuff that she's been putting out over the past couple of years. But then again, I feel like that energy should also be directed towards, other maybe African leaders. Like I know the African Union took their sweet time. I think Beyonce actually, because I posted this on like my Instagram story, Beyonce actually posted something before the African Union like released a statement, just kind of commenting on the situation happening. So I was like, let's direct our energy there. Like, why aren't other African leaders, chiming in, or at least, just saying we stand in solidarity with what's happening, or, we are, also anti-police brutality. Like, I'm like, I wanted to see more of that.
Which
Yeah, but when was
everybody
the last?
could comfortably post that.
Yeah,
Right.
and when was the last time that the African Union really did anything? So like
I
in
know.
terms of timelines, Beyonce has probably shown more African support than the African Union in recent years. So
I know. That was, it was nice though. I think I follow the Ghanaian president on Twitter. I think he put something out. So that was nice to see. But I agree that our energy, we should put just, maybe a little bit more energy towards like holding our leaders accountable versus celebrities and things like that. How do you stay like hopeful and encouraged, especially when you're like, talking about like tough topics and, just issues happening on the continent? Like what keeps you like, I guess, still like hopeful and encouraged about Africa's future?
I think what keeps me hopeful is the fact that the conversations are happening. The fact that me and you can talk about something means we care about it. And that for me is hope. If you care about something, you're willing to work towards it, right? And even more so now after this large scale incident, people are caring not just about what goes on in Nigeria, but what goes on in other African countries as well. I think with the NSAS movement, one thing I noticed is that people weren't just promoting visuals from NSAS, they were promoting visuals from other issues from around the continent, like what was going on in Namibia and in Uganda. And typically, people tend to focus on what's going on in their country alone. Just because, it goes back to the point of I realized I was African when I came to the US. Before, I was just Nigerian. I did my own stuff. If there's any other country I cared about beyond Nigeria, it was the US, because they were so global, and the impact was so global. But for the first time, people are caring about what's going on in other African, not for the first time, but it seems like to a larger degree, people are caring about what goes on in other African countries and talking to each other, and realizing the similarities and the differences and how to use that to their advantage. And And that gives me lots of hope.
I've always thought that the worst type of problem to have is the problem that you don't know what the solution may look like, right? That this solution for a vision of a future Africa is just like nobody can imagine it. However, it's fairly easy to imagine what a good or a much better version of the African continent or your country or the community looks like. Constant power, no corruption, food, access to, like, it's happening everywhere else around the world. So it's not like we don't know what the solution looks like. And the easiest part is always the how. How is not the easiest part to figure out is the how. However, the action of doing the how is not easy, right? That's always the hard part, actually doing the work. I fundamentally just think that the bar to clear has been cleared so many times before by so many other people that we just need to figure out how to clear the bar. We need to leverage ourselves so that the African people have much larger leverage than those in power. We need to figure out ways to make sure that people are supporting each other internally, and this idea of Africanness and this commitment to generalized and shared success or failure is codified in each of our countries and in the African community as a group. And we need to just decide that, hey, we are going to fix the African continent. Enough people need to decide, hey, the issues we're going to target. And there are lots of people already deciding that, by the way. Lots of people are going and working on different issues. I think that's how the continent changes, right? The excited young people, excited older people even, that are saying, hey, before my time is up, I want to focus on working on this, on changing this, on influencing this. And it's already happening, and I think it's going to happen all over the continent. Some of them will fail, but if enough people try, I strongly suspect that the continent will push forward. There's so much to be optimistic about. African people are young, hardworking, excited to see a future better than the one that we currently have. You have to understand that this is the first couple of generations of young people who have now seen a better version of Africa. It has always been bad, right? And I was telling my mother this the other day, and we were having a discussion about it. She was worried about, the looting and some of the things that happened after the Enters, massacre at the toll gate. And I told her that, hey, and I was telling this to, or maybe I told somebody else this, but I was telling them that, the African leaders got very lucky, right? The Nigerian army is not big enough if all the young people are angry. Not remotely, not close enough. They got very lucky that a few stores got burnt. Big wolf. For people who haven't seen a more hopeful version of this country, can't figure out what they're going to eat next week, don't have job security at all, don't have access to good healthcare, can't even have ordinary power, right? Like electric power, they don't have. Like, if these people were true, the worst case scenario, the Nigerian leadership deserves the worst case scenario, and they're very lucky that it didn't happen. However, my argument is that I think the best case scenario can happen out of that. The Endsars movement itself is a testament to the fact that the best case scenario can happen. And we just need to be committed to making sure it does.
Wow. Thank you. And that really even answered my last question, which was, what excites you about Africa's future? Thank you both for being guests on Dear Diaspora. Thank you for sharing your super insightful opinions and perspectives. I definitely appreciate your time, and I hope that everyone goes over to the Pod Save Africa podcast so you can take a listen and just hear more about their takes on different African issues.
Thank you for having us again.
I hope you enjoyed that episode and learned more about the NSARS movement. For more information, be sure to check out the link that I included in the show notes. And don't forget to check out Pod Save Africa wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening to Dear Diaspora. If you like what you hear, please rate the show and leave us a review. If you really like what you hear, become an official supporter of the show by visiting patreon.com/Dear Diaspora. Appreciate you tuning in, and we'll talk to you next week.